Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who is the recipient of many medals for his military service, but also the recipient of the Ridenhour Prize for truth-telling, for speaking out about how the US and NATO's public statements about the war in Afghanistan conflicted with what he actually saw on the ground. So, in other words, yes, exposing lies, which I'm very happy you continue to do. So, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Professor. Always a pleasure to be here.
So, I guess you and me both, like the rest of the world, has been a bit surprised by these tweets or Truth Social post by Trump, and he recently, tweeted out some interesting remarks. He opened up with the statement that he now finally understands the conflict. What is it, 8 months into his presidency? He now understands the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and he seems to have embraced his inner Joe Biden and announced that Ukraine can win the war, take back all territory, and even suggests that they can take Russian territory. So Russia's a paper tiger. It's time for Ukraine to act. I mean, what do you make of this? Yeah, change in attitude.
Yeah, honestly, you got to back up a little bit and kind of put things in context. And his confidence right there that he says, "Yeah, now that I understand everything." Well, that's the same thing he said in, I want to say it was May of 2023, when he was still candidate Trump, and he was being interviewed by a British tabloid, and they said, "What about the Russia-Ukraine war?" And he goes, "Oh, I can have that deal over with in 24 hours." And he didn't just say the statement, but then he laid out his reasons why, and he was very specific. And he said, "I understand this situation. I know Zelensky. I know Putin. I understand what's at stake here. I understand the financial part of this, and it won't even be hard. It'll be easy. This is something I can do." So he already conveyed, before he even got into office, that he, quote, knew the situation and the players. And then, of course, everything that happened since that time. Also, maybe a week or so ago, uh, President Trump says, I just discovered that Europe was buying oil from Russia. What a crazy thing that is, he said. And I mean, that got my eyes open, because I'm like, what do you mean you discovered? In fact, in one of the interviews, he said, I caught them and then publicly laid them out. And I'm thinking, this has kind of been an open, not even a secret, just an open statement forever. It's been discussed all kinds of times about the vulnerability and the weirdness of fighting somebody, and you threw a proxy on the one hand, but buying their oil and paying them for it on the other was weird. But you see that this is what Trump keeps saying. And now he wants you to believe, now I understand the situation when I didn't before. And of course, based on what he said subsequent to that, there's no evidence that he actually understands any of the things that are involved with this. So when he then makes these proclamations about what Ukraine can do, and it was probably more important in this Truth Social what he didn't say. He didn't say, I'm going to bring additional sanctions onto Russia. He had been threatening that for a long time, or secondary sanctions and tariffs on China, India, Brazil, others, or even the European Union members who are actually buying oil. He didn't say any of that. He didn't say, I'm offering a new $61 billion package like Joe Biden did. He talked about his inner Joe Biden. At least Biden had a $61 billion his last year in office. Trump is so far, the only thing he's done is two $500 million packages, literally the only thing since he's been in office. Now he's saying he'll maybe give about $1 billion per month of ammunition and weapons, etc., over the next 10 months, which is just a tiny fraction of what Biden did, which itself didn't make any difference on the battlefield. So you can say that, yeah, Ukraine can go back to its 1991 borders, and they can even maybe go into Russia, all this, but there's no means to do it. So you haven't taken any of the actions that would even nominally help, like with the financial stuff. And of course, I argue that wouldn't actually help, but he didn't do those. So he didn't change any of the dynamics for Russia, didn't even make it harder for them, and he didn't do anything new to help the Ukraine side. So that kind of leaves, and I think if you saw the Fox interview with on Brett Baer with Zelensky last night, I think Zelensky got that because they asked him if he was surprised by the announcement. He said he was, but then in his answer, he didn't say I'm all excited about it. He just said, "Well, there's still a lot of difficult times ahead, and we have to get more support, et cetera." So I think he recognized what wasn't in that transcript.
There's always a lot of bluster, and it becomes same with the tariff, the threats of tariff. It becomes a low hanging fruit if you can just use big words and get what you want. But the ability to match words with action, it's not really clear because, as he suggested, he said he would put crippling secondary sanctions to destroy the Russian economy. But first, the Europeans have to do it, which would then be economic suicide for Europe. He says, it's time for Ukraine to go on the offensive and take back all territory. However, it's the Europeans who will supply the weapons, and then you should shoot down Russian jets if they approach or enter your airspace. However, we might not give you any backing. It depends on the circumstances. I mean, there's a lot of noise without any clear commitment. I mean, if I'm sitting in London or Paris or, well, Kiev for that sake, and trying to see how my policies should be adjusted based on what Trump has said, I might come up, and not having moved much at all. I mean, how it seemed to me that one of the key messages that came out of this was the opposite, though. That is that the war is being outsourced to the Europeans, but he delivered it in the language of, like a warrior giving his full support. But I'm not sure if there was anything there. How do you see
Right,
it?
right, and it's interesting, even in that issue you raised there about the security guarantees, Trump punted on that one too,
Yeah.
because he said, "Well, that's something we'll figure out after the conflict is over." And if you don't have that figured out until after the conflict is over, then you don't even know how the conflict is gonna end, and that's gonna have, some impact on whether you supply security guarantees if this side loses. And of course, that is the primary side. So, I'm telling you, Glenn, I think you might have to calculate that this was just Trump's way of punting. And instead of just saying, "I'm gonna walk away," which would have accused him, left him open to accusations that you're abandoning Ukraine, you're not doing anything, and you lost, because that's what he would be blamed. It's instead like he's trying to use words to make it sound like, "No, I gave them authorization to go into Russia itself, and if they can't do it, that's not on me. We're giving them some weapons, and NATO's giving them some weapons." So basically, to absolve himself from any responsibility or threats of accusations later. But the fundamentals are there. And I think, as you said, you're talking about London, Paris, Berlin, Kiev. I think they get it. I think they interpreted correctly because they see you didn't put anything else in my hands, and then you told me to go into the lion's den without any additional help. And that probably won't end well.
Well, he also suggested that um, that the Europeans, or sorry, that the Ukrainians should go after Russian territories, and towards this end, they were going to get all the weapons they needed, but this time without any limitations, such as what Biden put on them. Now, this is quite important because if you use long-range missiles, this is if these are operated by Americans, they're using American intelligence and targeting and satellites, and the Russians would consider this to be an American attack. What do you make of this? Is this because afterwards Lindsey Graham appeared on the TV? He couldn't, cover up his smile. He was so excited. This time we're really gonna destroy and bring death and destruction to Russia. We're going to give all the weapons, no more limitations. I mean, was this just Trump shooting from the hip, or do you see
Yeah,
anything
I think
in
this
the
was
works?
Yeah, I think this was Lindsey Graham shooting from the lip is what this was. This is what he wants to happen. You may recall earlier this summer when there was a report that Trump was going to come out and put some heavy secondary sanctions on China and India and Brazil. That the Sunday before, Lindsey Graham came on with one of his Senate colleagues, Bloomberg, or Blumenthal, and he had the same glee and excitement and talk about these bone crushing sanctions. We're going to destroy the Russian economy and all this kind of really hyperbolic language. And then Trump did literally nothing on the Monday, I think it was, when he made his announcement, which was, pretty tepid about anything. It was more words than anything else. And Graham was kind of silent after that, didn't make any comments. And so I think that he believes, well, now then we're finally going to do it. But again, even he has to look at the fine print from this Truth Social post, because there's nothing in there about new sanctions, nothing. And there's nothing about any new weapon systems or ammunition beyond what's already been approved on the table. So uh, one has to wonder, does he really understand how wars work? And I'm not saying that as a condescending statement. It's a genuine question. Because if he thinks, number one, that the sanctions were going to work at all and not be, as you said, economic suicide for those applying them, that they also wouldn't have the intended effect that they would force either China, Brazil, or India to abandon Russia. I mean, that is beyond nonsensical, that no matter what pressure they actually had, they're certainly not going to succumb to whatever Washington ordered them to do to their own harm and their own long-term harm in terms of geopolitical issues. They're doing the exact opposite. They're wondering how much further they can support their Russian partners to their cumulative strength against our side here. And the idea that you can have some economic sanctions that are going to cause them more pain than it'll cause you, that would change behavior, when nothing has done that. And you can go back to 3.5 years of this war that it hasn't compelled, whether you're talking Iran or whether you're talking Russia, going back to 2014, really, and all these sanctions, they have never forced Russia into changing any policies. And why you think that's going to happen now is concerning, because it kind of looks like he does think that. And then on the military aspect itself, everything boils down to two main things, and in order. Number one is manpower, and number two is industrial capacity. And if you don't have the manpower, it then almost doesn't matter how much tanks and ammunition and weapons and missiles and everything else you have, if you don't have enough men to use them, if you don't have enough men to hold ground, or in a best case scenario, to take ground. You have to have large numbers of well-trained men in comparison to how many the other side has. And in that regard, Russia has the irrevocable advantage in manpower, and they have an irrevocable advantage for the foreseeable future in the industrial capacity. So in a war of attrition, which this is, Russia has all of the primary cards, the two biggest ones at all. And then you can add in other things like the amount of drones they have, the manufacturing capacity, aircraft, glide bombs, missiles, air defense missiles, all those things. They have more in every category than Ukraine has or can get. And so there should be no room to have optimism militarily or economically. And yet, that's what we're saying out loud.
Yeah, I saw the foreign minister of Hungary, which is, by the way, Hungary is a big supporter of Trump. They don't seem to be able to stop throwing praise at him, but even the foreign minister of Hungary came out today and argued that if the U.S. demands that they cut their oil imports from Russia, then they will reject this. So even, and this is Hungary, a small country which can be pressured, threatened, and they're already very pro-Trump, but even they will resist it. The idea that they can make the Chinese or Indians break, it seems very foolish, especially the Chinese know that they're next in line, so that doesn't make any sense. But India just displayed that they're not going to be treated like a European, that they will push back. But I guess this is why I wanted to ask, which you already discussed to some extent, which is the difference between political will versus capabilities. Because here in Europe, the assumption is always that America has unlimited resources. If it's just political will to destroy Russia, then of course Washington can do it. I mean, how much weapons is there actually to send now? Because Biden himself, at the end of his term, recognized that he didn't really have that much more weapon to send.
Right, yeah. You may recall, rather infamously, Jake Sullivan, then National Security Advisor, said, "Hey, listen, folks, we don't have enough air defense missiles for ourselves to send. No, the reason we haven't given is because we don't have them to give." He said that toward the end. I want to say it was December 2024. And then you had Marco Rubio, and I think it was in his Senate testimony in the early part of the year after he'd been confirmed. And he said the same thing. He said that, look, there's a reason why you don't have anybody else giving them. They have some in Europe, have some. We don't. We don't have them to give. And of course, I think that was even before then. We had expended a great deal in the Red Sea trying to quell and militarily suppress the Houthis, which didn't succeed, or this massive, so-called 12-day war with Iran that we helped support. We ourselves attacked. We also helped Israel with a lot of missiles, and especially air defense missiles, because there was lots of heavy body blows being struck back and forth between the two during that period of time. And now then, apparently, there's a $6 billion new arms package in the works for Israel. And they're going to be asking for a lot of the same categories, and there just isn't enough to go around. I don't even know where you're going to get this $6 billion package without seriously degrading American capacity below where it already is. We'll have to see if that's all future production, et cetera. But even if that's the case, there's a very limited industrial base. So if you commit $6 billion to Israel, even if it's all future production, then it's a zero-sum deal. That means you're not producing them either to backfill our own stockpiles or to provide additional capacity for Ukraine if this war should somehow drag on for years. We don't have the ability to do this. So it is all rhetoric. It is about as meaningful as the ink written on that Truth Social post.
But yeah, the Truth Social post, though, I mean, it's often I'm inclined towards dismissing it as rhetoric or just the way Trump speaks. But a lot of this, though, it was well, borderline lunacy. I mean, the way he referred to Russia as a paper tiger, Ukraine is winning. I mean, we are really going back to this, and Russia's in a
And I wanted
desperate
to point that out
situation.
too,
Yeah.
because you're right. There are fundamentals involved here, and they are immutable, and they're not hard to figure out. I mean, a lot of it you can just count. But there is an additional layer of concern that we should all have on our side, in that is we are having to parse the words that Trump spoke. We're having to think what he said before and what the fundamentals are, what the math is, that et cetera. And then we have to interpret things. And that is a dangerous situation you want to get into, because what if I interpret it different than Trump means it, or if, God forbid, Russia interprets it in a different way, they think something different. It's no way to do business. This whole idea of the madman theory, where they don't know what you're really thinking, so that you can somehow get a better deal, that is not at play here. Let me just strip that away. This is the lunacy theory, because you don't know what they mean, and you're left to try to figure it out on your own. And if Trump intends X, Y, and Z, but the other side interprets A, B, C, you got a problem. So there is something to be said for openness and forthrightness and being honest about what you say. Now, you can put things in diplomatic language, but you can't be dissimulating and talk weird stuff like what you just mentioned there about winning, about paper tiger, all this stuff. That's irrational and not connected to the truth at all, and does nothing to help international security or to get this issue resolved.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask how you think Russia might interpret and respond to this, because the whole Nixon's madman theory was premised on the idea that other, great powers, primarily the Soviet Union, wouldn't be able um, to probe the United States too much or provoke, because the fear would be you never know how the U.S. might react. Now, Trump embodies some of this. I mean, if I was advising Moscow, I would say, be a bit careful. We don't know, he can react in very unpredictable ways. But that being said, if Russia can't really step this one back, if they do consider this to be an existential threat and they're now winning, that means they're eliminating an existential threat. Some crazy statements from Trump isn't going to make them suddenly capitulate or back down. So the Russians must respond to this in some way, which can't be to de-escalate. They're going to have to prepare for
Yeah.
something,
You
no?
know what I think, Glenn, is that they will just shrug their shoulders. I think they'll just go, "Huh, that was interesting," and do nothing different. I don't think they'll change any course of action. I think they have a very clear methodical or organized and resourced plan to how they're going to bring this war to an end. I think that they recognized months ago that the hope that maybe Trump could come in and organize and coordinate some sort of negotiated settlement. They gave it every chance in the world. They hoped that it would work, but I don't think they ever counted on it. And now that I think that they had just said, okay, there is no plan here, there is no capability, Trump cannot deliver. So I think they said, then we have to deliver. We're going to accomplish our objectives on the battlefield. Putin said that less than a month ago at Beijing, in fact, specifically. He said, we still like negotiated settlement, but we're prepared to win this on the battlefield. I think that's just what they'll continue to do, because Trump didn't say anything in there that would threaten Russia, like something new, like we're going to give Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, which could be nuclear tipped or something like that, or I'm going to give security guarantees, or we're thinking about adding our troops to this area, whatever. That would be different. Then that would be something they might have to respond to. But as it is, it was all words on a post, and the words meant no actions by the United States, only just like Ukraine can do whatever it wants to do, and I approve of them doing whatever they're going to do. But Ukraine can't do those things, so it doesn't matter. So I think that it's just going to further convince Russia that the only path is a military victory for their side.
That's why his language is so confusing, because when he made the statement that Europe should shoot down Russian jets, this for me, this sounded close to a declaration of war. But then the next second, when he's asked, well, would you back the Europeans if they do this, and says, well, we'll have to see. I mean, this is we're not going to back up the NATO allies. He applauded them for paying their fair share, and making this a transactional thing. But suddenly it went from a threat to Russia to now almost a warning to the Europeans that you can't count on us. You might be on your own. I mean, this changes suddenly everything. So it's very hard to see who is taking a swipe at times. But
Although I will point out, though, that the Washington Treaty itself, like an Article 5 declaration, never, of course, means an automatic war, but never means automatic joining for any member state, not in the United States, but every nation will consider an attack on one an attack on all. And everybody always forgets the and, especially in the U.S., and each parliament or national legislative body will then on their own decide what action they should take. So even prior to all this, and whether you're talking about even Obama or Biden, who were big internationalists, even they would say, all right, well, before we get plunged into a war, we're going to make sure it's in our national interest. That's it was one of the sticking points with the actual formation of the Washington Treaty back in 1949, et cetera. And so, all nations want to have that flexibility, but we've kind of turned it over the years into just, well, an attack on one means an attack on all, and therefore we're all at war. And it's never actually meant that, and even less so under Trump.
yeah, it suggests everyone should take actions, but as I said, even specify, including military force if necessary. If this was obligatory, you wouldn't have to put that in there. So no, it's I think well, it isn't black and white, but the way it's been redefined, or the
Well, because
new spirit of it.
prior to the end of the Cold War, no one questioned it. I mean, yeah, that was in there. That was always going to be a factor. But if the Soviet Union attacked one of the members, and of course, if it was rolling wide, it would be an existential threat for all. And it's virtually assured everyone was going to do that. Problem is, this is not the Cold War. That's not the Soviet Union anymore. And now then, the idea that some Russian Red Army is going to roll over all of Europe is just nonsensical for many practical reasons. And so now then, countries are going, I don't want to get into some stupid war that I don't actually think threatens me, as opposed to the USSR, which may have threatened the entire continent. Now that's not the case. And many people, aside from the rhetoric, recognize it behind the scenes. And so now then they will be a lot less excited about getting into a conflict should something happen. And let's just say Romania or Poland or something like with this happen with these air incursions or whatever, if there should be a shoot down, you're not going to see a lot of countries or all the European countries rush to go, yes, let's fight a war with Russia. Even if that happened, I think they would say, let's talk about this. So that's the new reality that I think people really don't have a firm enough understanding of.
Well, I'm thinking that in the past, whenever Ukraine looked like it was struggling or losing, NATO always responded by escalating, sending more powerful weapons in large quantities. And well, I've been arguing for quite some time now that as we're seemingly entering the end game, and we see that the Ukrainian front lines are collapsing, they're not able to refill the ranks as they're taking more and more casualties. It seems as if it's predictable that NATO countries would have to escalate yet again in an extremely dangerous way, but it's not clear yet how. And I think it would be dangerous given that there's not that much that can be done to fix the manpower problem. And also, we don't really have that
Well,
much
yeah.
more weapons. So I'm waiting for someone to get very desperate and do something very stupid. And I guess it was in this context that I saw Trump's comments with some concern, because the way the we media across the West and Ukraine is interpreted is, well, Trump is back on our side now, which I'm not sure what it
Yeah.
means, but I guess the
No,
war with Russia.
that's what I think what Trump intended, but it's not practically accurate. And to your point, all these things we did in the past, I mean, I could argue, and apparently you did too, each one of those independently, I could tell you why they weren't gonna make any difference on the battlefield, uh, for again, for very fundamental reasons, but it sounded good, it looked good on paper, and it seems like, yeah, man, that, you're talking about 777 artillery pieces at first, and then okay, the ATACMS and the HIMARS situation, and then the tanks, the Challengers and the AMX-10s from France and all this. Everybody, because those are high marquee profile or platforms, and surely that will make a difference. Or surely the long range weapons. Finally, we took the gloves off, and it never made any difference. And that was evident it was going to. Problem is now you don't have any more of those platforms. You've literally given everything to include F-16s, and they didn't make a blip on the screen for, again, predictable reasons. But so now then, what do you have left to do except fight for Ukraine and send your troops over there? Well, I think it was Mr. Bell from Sky News about a month or so ago said, well, let's take a look at this, this coalition of the willing, this reassurance force, in the event that there's some kind of a peace agreement and it's going to be manned by Ukraine or European troops. He said, where would those troops come from? This is for reassurance force. And he said, if you took it France and UK and you used basically their entire deployable force, that would get you about 20% of the needed troops just for a reassurance force. Now, if you're talking about combat power, like we're actually going to fight Russia, that's obviously not a tiny fraction. So I think whatever Macron and Merz and Starmer and Ursula von der Leyen, whatever they may want, Kaya Kallas, those who seem to love the possibility of conflict with Russia, they do still look at their own little spreadsheets and go, yeah, we don't have that. And so why would they take an action, however much they may hate Russia, that they like, if we start this, we can't finish it, and we could be in even worse shape, and it could be our cities instead of these Ukrainian cities getting rubbled. And I don't think that they're going to do that. I think that they will not do the stupid thing out of purely self-interested reasons. So I think that Zelensky may recognize that, and maybe they're even telling him behind the scenes. And this just seems to me, and I think you said it a minute ago, it feels like we're entering the end game now, and there's no more cards to play.
Well, that would be my last question, because being here in Europe, one gets the impression that the governments aren't great at looking after self-interest anymore. The main thing it appears is
Fair enough.
show their blind loyalty to Trump in the hope that they won't that the United States won't leave us. But what do you make then of the Europeans ramping up the rhetoric lately? Because first we had this issue of the Russians were jamming the signals of von der Leyen's flight. This was a massive threat, and it turned out to be a fake propaganda stunt. So, well, definitely 100% disproven. But then we had the drone attacks on Poland, and the Europeans were very upset that Trump didn't push back harder against Russia on this. But of course, then it turned out not to be an attack. Even Poland confirmed that there were no warheads, and the Russians denied they had anything to do with it. Then you had the Russian jets over Estonia. Yet again, no evidence. The Russian rejected. And now, yesterday you had these drones over Denmark and Norway over the airports. Well, the Norwegian police say that, we haven't confirmed if there actually was a drone, so it doesn't seem like the evidence is in place. While in Denmark, the rhetoric is, well, across the European media, we can't rule out that this was Russia, which means nothing. It means you can't
Yeah.
rule out this or aliens either, or Zelensky himself. I mean, it's just quite meaningless. But maybe it's fake, maybe it's real, maybe the Russians are trying to bring the conflict to Europe, as the Europeans try to bring it to Russia. But even if it is fake, even if it's real, what the eagerness of escalating and hyping up this conflict, if they have nothing, if it's
Yeah.
or worse, they have nothing to back it up with. How do you explain it? Because
Uh,
I don't
I do have
understand
an idea,
Europe
and I'll
anymore.
tell you my operating theory, and this applies possibly more to the United States and to Europe, but definitely to various degrees on both. We keep thinking it's 1991 again. We keep thinking that we're in charge of everything, that Russia is a decrepit country, that China is still a third world nation, and that we can literally do anything we want. And then you get into the 90s to where we had advancing NATO, into the early 2000s where Russia was mad about stuff and they couldn't do anything about it. So we continue going on, et cetera. And so we did whatever we want. We didn't care what Russia said, what they did, anything like that. And there was never any consequence for it. That's kind of how it worked out. But now then, it's not 1990 anymore. And there is a powerful and growing China economically and militarily. And then because of our actions, now Russia is a lot stronger militarily than it was in 2022. So that ain't helping us out any, and that's because of the reaction to our own policies here. But mentally, we haven't got there yet. Like I said a minute ago, we're looking at spreadsheets, but maybe we're not looking at spreadsheets, or we just can't believe our eyes. And we still see thinking, well, if we say enough, if we do enough now, then maybe then the Russians will finally get scared. And so I think it's like desperation playing cards to look tough and like say, no, we mean it. Problem is, there's also on the Russian side, they've got a spreadsheet. They see the balance of forces and they're going, you're not scaring me, because if this does blow up into a bad situation, I can trump you in all of the categories that go into war-making capability big time right now. And I think that makes them a little bit more chippy on the Russian side and more desperate on the European side. So I do still have concerns that through miscalculation, fear, error, mistake, accident, something like that, we could get drawn into a conflict because you're making these really, I think, very foolish actions here on the European side instead of doing what makes self-interested, rational sense, which is to bring this war to an end under the best ugly terms we can get it off the table, and start the process of getting things rebuilt and lowering the temperature. That's what we should do, but it looks like we're going to continue to stay terrified all the way up to the end. And that's historically, where you have troubles with a declining empire, which I think you can in certain regards say that's what NATO and the West are right now, and a rising empire. And in this case, either China or Russia, or together with BRICS and all these other conglomerations that we're now compelling people to join against us, et cetera. So there is some concern, but I at least right now, if I had to put my money one place or the other, I would say when push comes to shove, they're going to back down and just look for somebody else to blame.
Yeah, that might be the direction we're going. And well, I know at least well, for the United States, I think it's will still have two legs to stand on. It can reposition itself in the world. It looks as if the situation is much worse in Europe. That is, the whole security arrangement built up again from the 1990s. All of this was premised on this collective hegemony as an equal partner with the United States. And I think the Europeans have a hard time, if they would accept reality that it is no longer the 1990s. Suddenly, it doesn't really have a new role in this multipolar world where the Americans do not want to be here. We can't really agree on anything. So it's no, I think yeah, this is not just about Ukraine. It's about holding on to a dying world order. So
Exactly. It's exactly what I believe.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's yeah, it's really, well, let's call it interesting times. So
Yeah. Let's just hope it doesn't devolve into catastrophic times. That would be bad.